Hey everybody, welcome back to another live stream lesson with AP World History Modern. We're here today to talk about the consequences, both cultural and environmental, of long distance trade connections. Just a quick reminder, I'm Chad Smith. I'm a World History Modern teacher in Irving, Texas at MacArthur High School. Before we dig into today's lesson and activities, let's take a moment, and go over your question from Mr. Logereau yesterday. A reminder that these skills are incredibly important as you prepare for the AP World History test. If you remember, you'll have a 45-minute DBQ. You'll have one question to answer. And in that question, you'll have 5 documents, but at least one of the documents will be a picture, map, chart, or graph. So you'll need to be able to rely on a picture and the description of that picture in order to be successful on the DBQ. So take a moment here and look at the picture, the first picture that was on the questions that Mr. Logereau sent you yesterday. It says, identify one way that image 1 illustrates an effect of Mongol rule in Eurasia. When looking at this picture, it's very difficult to see much of what's happening at all. You can see that maybe somebody is speaking and somebody is maybe working with some sort of paper or some sort of tabulations. You can see that there are people watching and listening. But one of the most important things when it comes to pictures is that you actually take time to read the descriptions given to you. So this description tells us that the illustration shows astronomers employed by the Mongol Ilkhans of Persia making calculations, charting their observations, and using astronomical instruments. So that's important because now we know that they've gotten all of these things, if they're in Persia, from different parts of the world. So the image shows that the Mongol Empire promoted scientific learning. It's difficult to see that from the image itself, but that's very clear in the description of the image where it says that the astronomers doing scientific work here were specifically employed by the rulers, the Mongol Ilkhans, the rulers of the Persian region of the Mongol Empire. The image shows that Mongols facilitated cultural contact and exchange. Much of the technology that they're using comes from other parts of the world other than the Mongols, and specifically other than this Middle East. So that's important to understanding the fact that they're using cross-cultural connections or their interactions with people as they've expanded throughout most of Eurasia or most of Asia. The image shows that rulers of the Mongol dynasty encouraged the development of learning and technology. Again, it's difficult to see this specifically in the image. However, it's clear by reading the description that the Mongol rulers were the ones who employed the people doing this scholarship and this scholarly work. Question B asks you a question about the purpose of the author or the purpose of the inclusion of this manuscript in, as it says down there, in a world history manuscript produced for the Mongol court. What would be the purpose of doing that? Remember, if you can analyze 2 of the documents on your DBQ by understanding the historical situation of the document, the intended audience of the document, the purpose of the author or the point of view of the author, and taking those things and showing how one of them impacts the understanding of the document or impacts the understanding of your argument, then you will be able to earn 2 points on the DBQ. 1 point for doing that source analysis once, and 2 points for doing that source analysis twice. So here's some potential responses to why this image would be included in a manuscript produced for the Mongol court. The image was likely included in the manuscript in order to demonstrate the cultural sophistication of the Mongols. If this is meant to be a history for the Mongol court, for anyone to understand who the Mongols are, this could counterbalance the charges of brutality by demonstrating how sophisticated the Mongols were. It also could be included to glorify the Mongol rule, which of course that glorification comes from the sophistication of the scholarship taking place. Another reason is that the image was included in the manuscript was to boost the legitimacy of the Ilkhan Mongol court in the eyes of the Persian Muslim elites. We've recently learned about how the Islamic State was well known for spreading information and innovation and technology around its empire. And so the Mongols would be able to increase their legitimacy by demonstrating that same emphasis and that same concern for education and innovation and technology. The final question asks us to look at a second picture. Just like the first picture, it's important that we take time to look at the description as well. This says, explain one way that image 2 illustrates the spread of scientific knowledge in the period before 1450. How does this show the spread of scientific knowledge? Well, first of all, the illustration shows the various stages of a physician's visit with a patient. And it tells us at the top that the illustration from a Hebrew translation of the Canon of Medicine, a Muslim medical text, which means that if it's a Muslim medical text, it wouldn't originally be written in Hebrew. The translation was produced by a Jewish scholar at the court of the Christian kings of Sicily, which is in Europe and Italy, around 1250 CE. So, how does this show the spread of scientific knowledge? Well, there's several ways that we can go about answering that question. The image illustrates that scientific knowledge in the period before 1450 was encouraged by cross-cultural exchanges, such as the interaction between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. The fact that the canon of medicine was produced by a Muslim scholar and translated by a Jewish scholar in Sicily, that's Italy, shows that scientific knowledge from the Islamic world spread to the other religious communities in the Mediterranean world. I should say that's modern day Italy. It's not Italy as we know it in 1250. Finally, the image shows that transfers of scientific knowledge in this period took place at the courts of rulers and can be assumed with the patronage of support of rulers. So, one reminder before we go on with this today is that these are not the only acceptable answers. So please take some time to give your answers to your own teachers and ask your teachers for feedback so that you can know if what you said makes any sense. All right, let's take a moment and read a new document today. And in this document, at the bottom of the screen, you have some instructions. I want you to look for evidence of cross-cultural interactions. Take a moment just to think about what that means. Cross-cultural, so different cultures coming across one another. Interactions, what happens as a result of those connections. So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes, and in these 2 minutes, I want you to read the document and look for evidence of cross-cultural interactions. A little bit less than a minute to continue reading the document and look for evidence of cross-cultural interactions. All right, let's look at the document together. So first of all, there's lots of evidence of cross-cultural interaction just by looking at the list of different kinds of goods. If you don't know for sure, I'll let you know that Sumatra is in the Southeast Asian region. Is in Southeast Asia, excuse me. So that means that when you're looking at the Indian Ocean, the Sumatra is in those islands down in the southern part of the southeastern part of the Indian Ocean trade network. So goods like Indian aloe and Chinese gold are all goods that have come to this region of Sumatra in Southeast Asia as a result of trade or cross-cultural interaction. Another reality is that there's a sultan there. And we've learned over the last few days that sultan is a specific term used to describe one of many specific terms used to describe a ruler who is Muslim and ruling a Muslim or theocratic empire. So the sultan was the person who was in charge here, which means that Islam has reached Southeast Asia. And so the spread of Islam into this region is another example of cross-cultural interactions. In the second paragraph, we see horses that are embroidered in silk. Neither of those two things, horses nor silk, are native to Southeast Asia, and both have been brought to the region through trade, as have golden anklets. Gold not coming from Southeast Asia, but most likely coming from Africa. Now, you notice that I highlighted the last phrase of the second paragraph in a different color. It says, it is not possible to sail to China at all times of the year. This point, if I had the opportunity to interact with you, I'd give you bonus points for telling me why the author here, Ibn Battuta, said that. But since I can't ask you to interact with me and give you bonus points, I'll just tell you or remind you about the significance of monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean trade network, and that they could only sail in certain directions for certain parts of the year because they were so dependent on the monsoon winds. Let's take a minute and get into what we're going to actually talk about today. Today's lessons and activity are all going to focus on the idea that long distance trade moves more than just manufactured goods. As a matter of fact, trade is almost never just about the goods that are being exchanged. So take about 90 seconds and I want you to brainstorm, what does this mean? If long distance trade moves more than just manufactured goods, what else could long distance trade be moving? I'll give you about 90 seconds to write down as much as you can. Actually, let's just go with 60 seconds to write down as much as you can, and then I'll tell you some of my ideas. Okay, so here are some of my thoughts. Long distance trade moves more than just manufactured goods. It also helps move people. And when people move from place to place, they interact with one another. And those interactions lead to the movement of customs and traditions, languages, religious beliefs, and science and innovation. As people interact with one another and trade goods and learn about one another, these things, these ideas, they all spread along with the manufactured goods. Another thing that moves are animals. Animals move from place to place just like people do. And that means that along with animal movement come disease and introducing new animals in new regions, just like we saw the introduction of horses in Southeast Asia. Another reality is that plants or crops often move along with manufactured goods as well. And this means that there's a new biodiversity in new regions. And sometimes, even though certain crops aren't native to a region, they can excel and really change the way that the economy and agriculture work in that region. And this always, always, always means one thing. More food always means more people. When there's biodiversity, an increase in biodiversity, and new crops are able to grow in new regions, you can guarantee that that's going to lead to a major increase in the population there. Let's take some time and look at some specific examples of these things that we've been addressing. One of the most famous examples of the spread of religion is when Buddhism spread from South Asia or India to China along the Silk Roads. And just like much, I don't know what I'm saying. It's also important to note that religion, when it spreads, it also often changes. The ideas of Buddhism changed as it moved to China, and one of the most famous examples is the idea that Buddhism in India and Buddha himself, never really wanted to be worshipped as a god. But by the time Buddhism had spread to China, Buddha had become worshipped as a godlike creature. Chinese Buddhism is often referred to as Zen Buddhism, and it also brings in characteristics and ideas of Taoism. This is called syncretism, or syncretic religious development, when two religious concepts from two different places mix together because of the diffusion or the spread of those religions and help develop new religious concepts. We'll learn about this soon. We've reviewed this before, but we're going to continue learning about this, especially as we move into units 3 and 4 and talk about even greater connections as a result of the connection of the two hemispheres after 1450. Another example of syncretism in China as a result of the introduction of Buddhism there is the Neo-Confucianism. See, when Buddhism started to come to China, particularly before the year 1200, it was very, very popular. But after the year 1200, there was a major resurgence of Confucianism. But this Confucianism incorporated some elements of both Taoism and Buddhism, which made it a more personal understanding of Confucianism. This type of Confucianism was called Neo-Confucianism. As a result of trade, particularly trade in the Indian Ocean Trade Network, both Hinduism and Buddhism, two South Asian religions, spread into major regions of Southeast Asia. Here's a Southeast Asian temple that has artwork that tributes to both Muslim and Hindu, I don't know what I'm saying, that tributes both Hindu and Buddhist religious and cultural concepts. Of course, it's a pretty modern picture, and today at this temple, Buddhism is practiced. As you can see, some young scholars here in the photograph. As a result of trade, Islam spread all across Afro-Eurasia. Islam, remember, is a religion that was started by a man who was a member of a family that was deeply involved in long-distance trade, and a society that was heavily reliant on long-distance trade. So Islam spread across the trans-Saharan trade route into sub-Saharan Africa, particularly with the creation of the Mali Empire and the major trade network city. Remember, we said the other day that trade builds cities, and one of the great examples of trade building major cities is Timbuktu. Here you can see a mosque in Western Africa in Timbuktu. Another example is the Swahili city-states along the eastern coast of Africa. And the creation of the Swahili language and the Swahili customs that were syncretic developments of East African beliefs and Arabic beliefs from the Islamic people. Islam spread into South Asia, where it became very popular as a result of the fact that it was a universalizing religion. Universalizing religion means it's a religion for everybody. And Hinduism, the most dominant religion of South Asia, was a religion that, while for everybody, put people into certain categories. And for a lot of people, they were put into categories called untouchable, categories that diminish them and oppress them to lower statuses in society. And so Islam was a way for them to escape from that. Urdu is an example of a syncretic language that developed as a result of the spread of Islam and Arabic into the region. Islam also spread into Southeast Asia. You can see a mosque here in the Strait of Malacca, where not in the Strait of Malacca, but in the Malacca Empire, the Sultanate of Malacca, excuse me, where many diasporic communities developed. Remember, we talked about diaspora 2 days ago. Diaspora is when a large group of people break off or leave, or oftentimes are forced to leave, but they migrate away from their homeland and into new lands. They become small minority communities. So there's many diasporas throughout world history, and one of the most commonly understood ones is a mostly voluntary diaspora of merchant communities developing around the Indian Ocean trade network. But not all diasporas are voluntary. Another reality is the spread of science and technology takes place as a result of long-distance trade. One of the most commonly recognized examples of this is Chinese papermaking and printing techniques traveled all the way to Europe along the Silk Roads. Another famous example of this is the spread of maritime technologies such as the compass, the Lattian sail, and the rudder. But the most famous example of the spread of science and technology as a result of trade is the expansion of gunpowder and how gunpowder became used as different groups of people for different ways. You can see here one of the first images or understandings of gunpowder, seeing it as a meteor going against the wind. Another reality of long distance trade is that crops spread. This meant that new crops could be grown in new regions. One of the most famous examples of the spread of crops leading to biodiversity in new regions is the spread of champa rice from Vietnam to China. Champa rice was a new strain or variety of rice that had not yet been grown in China. And champa rice was both resistant to flood and drought. That meant if there was too much water or not enough water or the just right amount of water, champa rice could still grow and produce an agricultural yield. So not only that, but champa rice was a very fast-growing grain, excuse me. And because of that, they could actually harvest 2 yields a year. That means they could get twice as much rice, and it was less vulnerable to the rest of the world, to the environmental problems. That was an extraordinary change for the economy and the agriculture of China. And like we said at the beginning of this discussion, that led to massive population growth throughout China. Another example was the introduction of bananas into sub-Saharan Africa. Bananas came to sub-Saharan Africa from Southeast Asia and were an important introduction to the regions and allowed for greater migration of a group of people in Africa known as the Bantu. I think at this point in our time of staying home and not going to school or not going to the park or not going to our concerts, I just missed my Kesha concert. I think at this point in our stay-at-home journey, we have a very firm understanding of how connections between people can help lead to the spread of the disease. One of the most famous examples of long-distance trade leading to the spread of disease is what's known as the Black Death or the Black Plague, which spread in the 1300s all the way from China to Europe. The Black Death spread in many ways because of the security of the Mongol Empire and also because of long-distance trade that took place from China along the Silk Roads and all the way into Europe. In the 1300s, particularly 1347 and 1348, the Black Death was its deadliest in Europe, where it killed up to 50% of the population in many places there. Okay, let's take a minute and go over what we've discussed so far today. So this phrase, this realization is key to understanding everything we've discussed today. Long distance trade moves more than manufactured goods. Long distance trade moves people. And when people move from place to place, they speak to one another. They get to know one another. They ask each other questions. This leads to the development of customs and traditions spreading, science and innovation spreading, languages, and even religious beliefs. As a matter of fact, one of the most common traveling companion for a merchant was a missionary. Another reality of long distance trade is that animals move from place to place. And when animals move, oftentimes animals carry diseases with them, such as the Black Plague, which moved through rats and fleas and animals, and also through human connections as a result of long distance trade from China all the way to Europe. Finally, the reality of plants and crops moving from place to place, and that sometimes, even though plants aren't specifically native to a region, they can thrive in that region and radically change the economic prosperity for the people there. So these are the cultural and economic consequences of connectivity. In other words, these are the effects of long distance trade. And these are the things other than manufactured goods that move around as a result of trade. Here's an opportunity for you to practice. See, one of the things we haven't yet discussed today is that in addition to long distance trade merchants, there were also several people who traveled and wrote back home to describe the new cities and show what they've learned as they've moved around the world. You've actually read from two of the most significant and recognized travelers of the period 1200 to 1450. In the last few days, you've read documents written by Marco Polo, an Italian traveler who managed to move all the way to China, and Ibn Battuta, an African Muslim who moved around the Islamic Empire and again was able to possibly travel all the way to China. So your homework for tonight is in your Google folder, which you can find in the description of this video here below. In the description of the video below, you go to the Google Drive, then you go into the review folder, and you find 2.5 and 2.6 homework reading. Quickly, I'd like to remind everybody, please don't ask for permission to edit the documents that we've placed in the drive. The way for you to work with the documents that we've placed in the drive is for you to make a copy yourself and move that copy into your drive. If it's not possible for you to do that, it may be because you're using an account like my students. My students have Gmail accounts provided to them through Irving Independent School District, but they can't make copies of what we post in the drive because there's rules with the way Irving ISD is set up the Google Drive. So it's likely that your Google has your own district, if you're using a student email account, that your own district has created limitations as well to keep you from interacting with people outside of your district. So you cannot have access or permission to the documents, but you can make a copy and move that copy into your own drive. So in this document, you're going to have rather long excerpts, certainly longer than what you'll get on a DBQ. One excerpt is from Marco Polo, and it's describing some of his travels. And the other excerpt is from Ibn Battuta, also describing some of his travels. I want you to read both of these excerpts, even though they're a little bit longer than a document-based question. And I want you to look for similarities in the way the two travelers described the places they visited. What were some similar ways in which these two travelers described the new places they had visited? Okay, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around with us today and continuing to work through our live streams. I hope that you're learning a lot, reviewing a lot, and getting opportunity to practice the skills you're going to need on your DBQ that you're taking on May 21st. Remember, the AP World History test is on May 21st. It's at 1 p.m. Central Time. So if you live anywhere from Dallas to Chicago, you're taking the test at 1 p.m. If you live on the East Coast, you're taking the test at 2 p.m. And if you live on the West Coast, then you're taking the test at 11 a.m. If you're not sure when you take the test based off your own time codes, make sure you ask your teacher, because everyone around the world, all 350 odd thousand students who are taking the AP World History test, are going to take it at the exact same time. Thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Mr. Logero will be back with you tomorrow to begin discuss the period 1450 to 1750.